In this channel, whenever we talk about the Middle Ages, we always end up also discussing the Inquisition. After all, the Holy Inquisition had a significant influence during that medieval period. Along with the Inquisition, there came the witch hunts throughout Europe. However, something that has always caught my attention is that the most famous case of witch hunting occurred after the Middle Ages and outside of Europe, meaning beyond the reach of the Inquisition's influence. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Interesting Day. In today's video, we will talk about the Salem witches, a case that happened over 300 years ago and became a part of history because more than 200 people were arrested and accused of witchcraft, with over 20 being sentenced to death, among other details. As always, I hope you enjoy it. Now, let's start by using our time machine and going back to the 17th century, specifically to the year 1692. This is where the whole story begins in the United States, in the state of Massachusetts, in a town called Salem. During that time, the United States was engaged in the 9 Years' War against France, which led to the destruction of some smaller villages and towns. The survivors, as refugees, ended up flocking to the city of Salem since it was their only option. Consequently, many unknown people from different places arrived in the town, triggering the beginning of various problems and conflicts. Some arrived with nothing and became beggars, while others resorted to theft. The demand for food increased, but the city's plantations couldn't feed everyone, causing prices to skyrocket. This situation didn't sit well with the existing residents of the city. As a result, wealthy families started competing with each other in a more aggressive manner. Not to mention the overall mistrust and uncomfortable atmosphere that prevailed in the small town due to the influx of strangers. To top it all off, in 1689, a man named Samuel Parris was appointed as the Puritan minister of Salem, a religious leader. Many people in the town despised him, claiming he was petty, lacking humility, ignorant, and proud, among other things. Fast forward 3 years to January 1692, when Reverend Parris's 9-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail, started behaving strangely. They would scream out of nowhere, contort their bodies even in the middle of the street, and sometimes claim to be feeling insect bites despite no insects being present. The town began to speculate that the Parris family was cursed. Then, another 11-year-old girl named Ann Putnam began displaying the same behavior and symptoms. And that was enough to spark a frenzy in the town. And even before any authorities gathered the three girls, the entire town of Salem was already talking about witches, spells, and curses. It was a true hysteria. Anyway, this is the somewhat blurry part. Nobody knows exactly what the girls said during their interrogations. It's unclear whether each girl identified a different woman, or if the magistrates themselves deduced it. But what happened was that three names emerged: Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. Now, Tituba, an Afro-Caribbean slave owned by Reverend Parris, had an important detail: her Afro-Caribbean background, which becomes significant later on. Sarah Good was a virtually homeless woman with nowhere to live, and Sarah Osborne was an elderly, poor, and widowed woman. Both Sarahs stuck to the strategy of telling the truth, insisting that they had done nothing wrong. On the other hand, Tituba, perhaps believing that the Puritans would be afraid and spare her life, started confessing. She claimed that she had already been practicing witchcraft and that the devil had appeared to her, forcing her to serve him. She told stories of black dogs, straw dolls, possessed cats, and so on. Remember when I mentioned her Afro-Caribbean background? Well, these stories she told were related to voodoo practices. To top it all off, Tituba also mentioned that there were other witches at large. I don't think I even need to say that the town, which was already in a tremendous uproar, terrified and in hysteria, became even worse. And that's how the witch hunt in Salem began. One of the most remembered cases is that of Martha Corey. She was a highly devoted churchgoer in Salem, always attending all the meetings. She had never done anything wrong, but she was used and condemned for witchcraft. This opened the eyes of the population, because if even that exemplary religious woman was accused of being a witch, then anyone could be a suspect. Another well-known case is that of Dorothy, a 4-year-old girl who was the daughter of Sarah Good. Dorothy was also interrogated, and I can't explain how, but through the answers of this 4-year-old girl, the authorities ended up condemning her as a witch. In May of the same year, they even created a special court for witches due to the numerous cases and scandals that were emerging in the city. They decided to establish a specific court to deal with the alleged witchcraft in Salem. Let's move on to another well-remembered case, that of Bridget Bishop. This woman is known as an old gossip and was also accused of witchcraft. She claimed her innocence, but instead of going to jail, she was sent to the gallows. Bridget Bishop was the first person to be hanged in what is now known as Gallows Hill, where many others would also meet the same fate. The case of Bridget Bishop is important not only because she was the first person to die due to this hysteria, but also because it shows how people were being accused based on personal issues. Of course, gossiping about other people's lives is ugly and even depressing for those involved, but I think killing someone over it is too much. There were several other cases like this. For example, a woman who lost her family and home during the war ended up living on the streets of Salem. She stole a chicken egg because she had nothing to eat and was accused of using it for witchcraft. Obviously, it wasn't about witchcraft, but a personal problem. Another absurdity was that if you claimed to have had a dream, vision, or nightmare about someone, it was taken as truth and served as evidence to condemn a person. In less than a year, over 200 people ended up in jail and 20 were executed, ranging from those without families and the poor to even important figures in the city. For example, George Burroughs, the church minister, was considered a leader of the witches and was killed. The soldiers of Salem, a few years prior, had fought a small war against the nearby natives and suffered many casualties. They blamed their defeat on this man, claiming he had bewitched and weakened the soldiers. To conclude, even dogs and cats were being killed in the city. The pets of the condemned were also killed because, according to the population, they could be bewitched. In the midst of all this chaos, a man named Cotton Mather, a Puritan minister from the area, emerged. He requested that dreams and visions not be considered as evidence, but he was ignored and the special witchcraft court continued to operate in the same manner. Cotton then contacted his son, Increase Mather, who had a voice in the matter. Increase Mather was none other than the president of Harvard, the most important university in the United States. He did not ask anything from the religious fanatics of Salem. Instead, he directly contacted the governor of the province, denouncing the fact that even dreams and visions were being used to condemn and kill people. Governor William Phips listened to the letter he had received, especially because the witch trials in Salem were already spreading, and even his own wife was being interrogated for witchcraft. Therefore, William Phips prohibited the detention of more people and released the majority of those who were already imprisoned. After that, only 3 more people were convicted of witchcraft in Salem in May 1693, marking the end of this story. The governor pardoned all those who were convicted, interrogated, or had any connection to what happened in Salem. As I mentioned before, over 200 people were arrested, but not all of them survived their time in jail until this story concluded. Many people also died in jail, likely victims of torture. For example, the little girl Dorothy, who was only 4 years old, spent 8 months imprisoned. Additionally, there were 20 deaths by hanging and 1 by crushing. The fate of the animals belonging to these people is equally disturbing. What's more infuriating is that when the dust settled, several people involved in the trials, including those who made accusations or even the magistrates and judges, publicly apologized, confessed to their exaggerations, and admitted their mistakes. but dozens of people had already died, leaving behind orphan children. This is something very hypocritical. On January 14, 1697, the General Court of Massachusetts requested that all residents of the state fast in memory of the Salem witches, who were never actually witches. In 1702, the same court deemed that the trials had not only been wrong but also illegal. It paid £600 to each heir of the victims. In 1957, 250 years later, the government made a formal apology, once again, too late. As you already know, this event became very famous, and the Salem witches are now remembered in an affectionate way by many writers, composers, and artists in general. It is common to see references to them in books, stories, music, series, films, and even in the names of some people. Share your thoughts in the comment. Thank you for joining us on Interesting Day. See you next time.